Sri Aurobindo is describing the evolution of the spiritual man out of the mental man. And in this, as always, he goes to first principles, essential insights, the foundations upon which everything else follows. As a result, everything that he describes has a character of such essentiality that it would apply to any being on any planet, anywhere in the universe, emerging from mind into spiritual consciousness. The universality of this whole presentation is so complete that it covers the working out across ages and as a result includes in its description all the variations and bylanes of the developmental process. Necessarily, such a perspective will have complex nuances as well as interconnections between the various movements of the processes of this transition. And we need not fear that by understanding the essential principles, everything becomes so simple and even as if obvious. In the portion we have so far read, Sri Aurobindo has described the distinction between the spiritual phase and the mental phase. And even though the mental phase of our evolution may tend or turn to spiritual, it may still be largely in a domain which is religious and involving disciplines which are preparatory to the spiritual proper. And the spiritual proper only begins when our consciousness turns to the inner reality of our being, to a spirit, self, soul, which is other than mind, life and body. And in that movement, there is a beginning to know that, to feel that, to enter in contact with that, to live in that, and then commune with it and unite with it. And all of these are stages which culminate in a transformation by that on this, where that which we entered was different from mind, life and body. That now takes charge of mind, life and body and recasts them in its terms. And that will be the culmination of the spirituality. And that is part of the spiritual development. Anything preparatory of mind, life and body which makes this possible, the opening to the spiritual as well as the turning of the spiritual upon them to transform, is to be welcomed, is necessary, but is not yet spirituality in itself. This also leads to the interesting insight that there is in fact a double evolution. The outer nature must prepare itself to be capable of supporting a spiritual emergence as well as participating in a spiritual transformation. At the same time, the actual spirituality is taking place in the inner consciousness and in the soul's evolution, paralleling this. Necessarily, he says, this causes a difficult and slow spiritual advance because each step of the spiritual emergence has to wait for the outside to keep up, to catch up and to keep up, and so on. As a result, he justifies the impulse in humanity to hurry up and as if abandon the outer change and withdraw into free spiritual liberation inward. But this absolutism, this spiritual emergence in isolation from nature, he points out, leads to the asceticism, illusionism, tendency of otherworldliness, etc. It is justified when there is this urgency to realize the spirit, but this is an extremism of a kind that is not accepted by nature. In fact, nature herself wants to receive the spiritual development And so we find, he says, a double tendency in the spiritual emergence. One side strives to the establishment at all costs of the spiritual consciousness, even if necessary, abandoning nature. On the other side, a push towards the extension of spirituality to our parts of nature. And the spiritual awakening itself is not complete unless it seizes upon everything and includes it. And so there are two stages. The first is an emergence into a greater spirituality, and then only you can turn upon to change life. And we discussed last time how this even has its historical justification for the ascetic phase, where the ascetic phase allowed humanity, which was still not ready for a spiritual transformation, to break out of the limited human nature, enter into some realm of higher experience, so that later on the strength of that, and while waiting for the spiritual emergence, there may be a greater reconciliation and unification of spirit with nature and even matter. And that is always preceded by first a strong emergence of the human mind and the power of the intellect and the individualization, which Aurobindo describes as the age of individualism and reason, followed by a strong sense of failure of the intellect, a sense of having been deceived by the promise of the intellect, and therefore a turning towards something deeper and inner, which may not be spiritual at first, but which prepares the way for a bridging from the spirituality awakened with the outer surface life of man. And we are in that passage today, what he describes as the subjective age, which has begun and increasingly is deepening. But this is the age in which the past spirituality, although experienced in separation from life, now begins to reawaken without such a harsh separation. And we see this everywhere in the common life of people, where they turn for a little bit of spirituality to bring a little bit of joy in their life, or to bring in some sense of fullness which is missing, to complete the material satisfaction with something higher. Or on the other side, those who were in an exclusive ascetic spiritual pursuit, now feeling the need to reach out and give to it more complete forms. And this is again what we are seeing today in the world. But he points out that this first awakening is the one thing needful that has to be done by each, on whatever line is possible to him, by each according to the spiritual capacity developed in his nature. And this is the first awakening to pure spiritual consciousness. Obviously, this is for us, as practitioners of the integral yoga, the priority. And this phrasing he uses, where we paused last time, one thing needful, by each on whatever line is possible to him, makes you wonder, what does he mean by whatever line? And immediately in the next paragraph that now we take up, he explains. In considering the achieved course of the evolution of the spiritual being, we have to regard it from two sides. A consideration of the means, the lines of development utilized by nature, and a view of the actual results achieved by it in the human individual. So first, he will discuss what nature tried to do to prepare us for this spiritual evolution. What has she actually done looking back in the last few thousand years, where she was preparing for this period of human transition? How did she awaken in us the spiritual turn, or what were the lines in which that spiritual turn could be broadly classified? And so we will see here 4. And then later he will summarize what has been done in those 4 lines so far, and that will give us a picture of what we need to do today. In the process, he is also showing us, he's as if looking back at the past and taking all the best that has been developed, bringing it to a level of integration or readiness for integration in the new leap that we are now entering in. What of that is relevant? What of that was necessary at that time but is no more relevant for the future? That part comes later. But first we see what was nature's approach. And again he goes to first principles. And this is one of those very classic statements of Sri Aurobindo, where he just says, this is how it is. And when you think about it, and he will show you how it is so, but when you think about it, it is like a master who sees from above the full span of human knowledge, the full spectrum of possibilities, and he is able to see the core principles behind everything, and he just says, this is how it is. And so when we align ourselves intuitively, we also share in that something of that grand vision. So he says, there are 4 main lines which nature has followed in her attempt to open up the inner being. 4 main lines. You could find 5, 6, 10, 100, but they would all be as if subcategories within these 4 broad lines. What are they? Religion, occultism, spiritual thought, and an inner spiritual realization and experience. So think about what each of these means. Religion, it's quite obvious. There are so many systems of religion that we see all around, and each obviously turned towards God in some way, or some idea of absolute or transcendence, even if not God. The second is occultism. In occultism, we do not necessarily see obviously the spiritual dimension, but what we do see is the opening up of the inner being. Because the whole nature of the occult, and the very name tells you this, it is hidden, it is concealed, it is secret. Well, you have to go behind the veil to access that which is secret, and the veil is what separates the outer from the inner. And so any kind of training or practice of occultism opens to you experiences of the inner life, precisely the same inner domain where you would also have access to the spiritual more easily if you turned to it. Third, which is not so obvious, is spiritual thought. And you will see philosophies which turn to spirit. And it could take forms which are not always spiritual in form. Even if you take modern science and see where it goes in its most speculative pursuits. They speak, for example, of the origin of the universe. Now, there's no way you can verify whether that theory is valid or not, but it's a theory. And maybe there are many theories. But when you see where those theories turn to, they're actually trying to get to something which is absolute, something which is real, of which the universe itself is an expression. And as you enter that domain, you enter philosophical forms, speculations, which, although they have the name of science and the form of science, actually are a philosophical, speculative journey, but turning to spirituality. And they often have this character of spiritual thought. In the beginning, before the Big Bang, well, there has to be a poise where time and space don't exist, and which creates space and time, isn't it? Otherwise, there would be a question of what happened before the Big Bang. And you can't ask that because Big Bang originates everything. A lot of this Big Bang theory in modern physics actually came from the strong influence of the church, of Christianity, in which there is this sense of a beginning of the universe where God said, let there be light, and there was light, and through so many days he built the universe. So the sense of an origin was very strong because of the influence of the church. And although science rejected church, Christianity, and with it spirituality, it still held the strong imprint of that kind of thinking. So in physics, always there had to be a starting point when everything began from the habit. But there are other traditions, for example in Buddhism, where you don't have a beginning or an end, where everything always was, always will be, and it's like that. You will see the same idea in certain Upanishadic formulations predating Buddhism, where they speak of the world as an expression of the divine consciousness which is simultaneous. Whenever there was divine, there was world. So there was never a time when there was no divine, and so world always is paralleling it. But within world there might be cycles of collapse, explosion, or change, and radical cycles of transition, maybe. But world always was there. And all of this speculative thought automatically prepares the mind for something greater than itself. You're talking about, thinking about infinity, eternity, timelessness, spacelessness, transcendence beyond form. And what's it like? And of course the mind can't catch it, but the very attempt as if turns mind towards spirit and makes it, in the power of thought, a capable receptacle. Why is this important? Because when in fact we have an experience of the spirit, inevitably the spirit has to be in the experience infinite, eternal, and essentially one, indivisible. That is how spirit is. And if you have not had that, then it's not spirit. But when you have that and your mind is not ready to catch even the sense of the infinite, it will reduce the experience to its limited container. The picture is of going to measure the ocean with a little cup. How will you measure it? Of course you can do the exercise of measuring, and you can keep counting 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups, but you never have any sense of the wideness of the ocean. And unless there is in you the capacity to open your cup to literally embrace something which is really vast, maybe even approaching or turning towards the infinity, you will not feel the sense of the approach of infinity. And if that readiness has been there through this spiritual thought, even if it is speculative philosophy, through mathematics, through physics, through sciences, your mind or your receptive perception is ready. And when the presence is felt, you feel its vastness, you feel its timelessness. They are familiar experiences, familiar even ideas in which it can settle more completely. So this again prepares you for this and turns you to something of the inner being. And the fourth, an inner spiritual realization and experience. Obviously, when that happens, you have an experience of your inner regions. So he says of these four, the three first are approaches. The last is the decisive avenue of entry. Now the 4 streams that nature has used, 4 lines through which nature has prepared us to open the inner being. The 4th line, which is the direct experience, is the natural culmination of the other 3. But it could also be the beginning. The other 3 are incomplete and have not fulfilled themselves if they have not at least turned towards the 4th. And so we do not see the 4th as the culmination of these 3. We see it separate because you can as easily enter it directly. How would you do that? For example, you step into nature, you step into the forest, top of a mountain, sit before the ocean, and just as you gaze, suddenly the sense of the infinite, the sense of a living presence, the sense of a sacred, the sense of time having stopped. All of these simply dawn on you, or any of these dawn on you, and there you have it. You did not need religion, you did not need occultism, you did not need spiritual thought. You have a first contact with the experience, and you could simply continue chasing after the experience. But there can be a problem. If there has not been the culturing of spiritual thought, you will always reduce the experience to your current capacity, or let's say incapacity. You'll always reduce the ocean to your maybe bigger bowl, but still measuring it out by bowls. You will always reduce it to an aspect which to you is your idea of the divine, but not being able to go beyond. And there have been many great masters in history who have had or entered into extraordinary spiritual experiences, become as if initiators of a whole movement of revelation or teaching. But extremely narrow or one-sided in its form because that's all that they had. And you can see now why the spiritual thought might be important. Further, as this experience deepens, you might find you have an experience of things. Let's say you feel the presence of the forest, but that presence is too strong and you're unable to engage with it. You're unable to know it deeply or enter into a relationship of equality or even mastery of it. And so there is always a subservience or inferiority or a dependence. I have to plead, I have to ask, I have a need for, and in something which limits the power of the spiritual experience to freely exercise itself. And this is where you can see why the knowledge of the occult or the perception of things occult and the ability to engage or intervene on that level would make your the power of the spiritual experience more complete. And again, if it stopped there is this great being that is the volcano, and I feel its sacred presence, I learn from it, and it teaches me so much, but it stops there. You may never go beyond the form. I meet the volcano, someone else meets the river, someone else meets a tree, sacred tree. All three of us have our own teachers and experiences, but what is there to unite it all? Nothing. And this is what you see, interestingly, in Japan. There was the tradition of the Shinto, which looked at and perceived the sacredness in nature, through nature, but it had so many different facets and aspects. It went very deep in what it developed, but it lacked that uniting principle. And interestingly, in the civilization, that need was perceived, and they caught it when they met Buddhism. And they wove Buddhism into the Shinto tradition, Buddhism giving the underlying oneness and the transcendence beyond the forms, in which all the Shinto rich foundation could unite to create this more complete than Buddhism experience and more spiritual than Shintoism realization. And the two blended into each other smoothly because the civilization was awake and sought and could catch what was needed and unite it. You don't find this happening everywhere though. But again there, the element which religion would have brought, the recognition of one source, one being, one reality or transcendence in which all these experiences would join or from which they originate. And so you can see how even if you took this exclusive starting point of inner spiritual realization and experience, the other three would complement. So we cannot say that any of these is a beginning and the other is the end. Each needs as if the other three. And that's why the way Sri Aurobindo puts it, these are four main lines of development utilized by nature in her attempt to open up the inner being. If she did not bring in these four lines, what would happen? You would still continue to live in the outer. There would be nothing of the inner potential developed because nothing in us feels the urge for it or the need for it. The urge and the need for it are actually kick-started by nature. Because nature provokes this, suddenly I feel something is missing. I need something more satisfying, more deep. Because nature pushed you or pulled you. Because nature takes you there, you enter the forest and you're drawn into the inner experience of the presence. Nature is doing it to you. So what you see here, nature herself seems to have a double objective. Not only creating the external form and perfecting it as far as she can, but she wants you to awaken to your inner being. And that's why when she gets a chance, and you are alone on the mountain or the forest, free from your mobile phone and your television and your preoccupations of life and worries, she catches your moment of vulnerability. And I'm using this word intentionally. You didn't want it. You didn't expect it. But you're vulnerable and she can poke you and push you, nudge you. And once you've had that glimpse, you say, wow, this is so beautiful. I must do this every week, every weekend, every year, whatever form it takes. I've known of people who go trekking in the mountains. They love it so much. They go alone. They don't like being with others. They walk long hours. They walk for days together until the body is as if exhausted. And that's when something of the inner vitality kicks in. And the subtle body slightly separates from the physical and draws vitality from the universal vitality. And there is an altered state just from that sustained effort of tiredness. And you have a renewed burst of energy, but more clear, more refined, more uplifted. And for them, this, they say, is my spirituality. This is my spiritual experience. But it takes me a few days to build it all alone, walking on the mountain. But on the other side, when they're going for that and yearning for it, nature also is waiting to embrace, to carry them and to give them the experience they want. But, as we have always seen, nature works within her limitations. There is something greater possible whose intervention can enormously speed up this process. But the first three are approaches, the last is the decisive avenue of entry. And of course, as we have seen, we need all four. All these four powers have worked by a simultaneous action, more or less connected, sometimes in a variable collaboration, sometimes in dispute with each other, sometimes in a separate independence. Now, big picture, he's looking at the whole sweep of human history. What you see common is what he first describes. What you see as exceptions are what he describes second, and then third, and then fourth. So you have to see the sequence is very important. The thing which you see across time, and I will even say across space, across planets, across civilizations, across the universe, and of course within our Earth, all these four have worked by simultaneous action. You will never find one of these not being accompanied by the other three. It may be against the other three, it may try to separate itself, but always the other three will be there. So even if, for example, you take religion, there will be aspects which are more occult, which will have a spiritual thought or a inner experience which will always be dragged along. Or with occultism, similarly, inevitably there will be something of the other three, and so on. He'll give us a few indications of and examples as we go along. But they are simultaneous. You cannot really isolate. This is the underlying greater truth. Upon this is a secondary truth, that when they are simultaneous, they are more or less connected. You do not always see the horizontal links, but somehow it's there. Sometimes in a variable collaboration. So a few group, occultism may assist religion, religion may assist occultism, or spiritual thought may assist inner experience. Variable collaboration, shifting, changing patterns. Above that, a still rarer variation, which is sometimes in dispute with each other. So even religion will say, that occultism, get rid of it. It is dangerous, it will take you to the devil. Or the spiritual experience will say, get rid of your thinking. It's coming in the way. Why don't you just open directly to the experience? And why are you getting stuck with religious forms? Live the ideal, and so on. So they will go against each other, and that's a tertiary truth. And fourth, still lesser truth, sometimes in a separate independence. This is the least true of these, because when one of these says, I am cutting off from the other three, you never really cut off, because the underlying truth is they're always together. But I can convince myself that I have cut it off. So religion can say, no occultism, no spiritual thought, and I just stay with my practice. Experience doesn't matter. There are actually schools, even today, which wear the ochre robe. They initiate, in India, they wear the ochre robe, they initiate people into the sannyas, renunciation, and all they teach is the philosophy. And somehow understanding the philosophy makes the person feel, now I have understood that the whole world is an illusion and only I in my essential consciousness, I'm real, and my essential consciousness is one with everyone. They've understood it to a point where they've given it a practical form. I look upon each as my brothers, sisters, colleagues, and that's it. This is the spirituality. And in one particular case that I'm aware of, the head of the institution was asked by someone, "Don't you practice meditation?" And he says, "Oh, all that is just a waste of time. You have to understand, you have to study, and that's how you will get the true spirituality." And he was so convinced that was it. So it's surprising, but it happens, and the ones who have it feel so complete with what they have that they don't need the rest. So it seems as if sometimes in a separate independence. I give another example which is not so well known. Jiddu Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti, is very famous for his semi-Buddhistic, semi-Vedantic view, which basically played through mind to declare that all this is appearance and there is no finality, and you have to simply cut off all systems, cut off all forms, cut off all thoughts, and get free of it. The problem is there is no other way except cutting. So you keep negating, and at some point you get frustrated if you have not broken through to a deeper insight. But he himself lived in a much deeper consciousness. And there are interesting incidents narrated by some people who are very close to him, where they even saw him performing a miracle, where he obviously did something which involved drawing a higher power or intervening in a certain way which would be miraculous, or showed or at least revealed the fact that he had some deeper knowledge and capacity of which he never spoke. All of his life he was only breaking systems and denying the mind's sufficiency. But it stopped there, at least in his public discourses, and that's the large part which is taught. That other side he never spoke of. And when the people who saw him do those things, when they tried to raise it, he refused to speak about it. So inevitably you find, even in paths where they may seem to be exclusive, the founder inevitably has something of the other three, otherwise he cannot carry his movement. So you see, all these four powers have worked by simultaneous action, more or less connected, sometimes in a variable collaboration, sometimes in dispute with each other, sometimes in a separate independence. So 4 layers, but you can see the common base. Now he gives examples. Religion has admitted an occult element in its ritual, ceremony, sacraments. It has leaned upon spiritual thinking, deriving from it sometimes a creed or theology. Sometimes it's supporting spiritual philosophy. The former ordinarily is the Occidental method, the latter the Oriental method. But spiritual experience is the final aim and achievement of religion, its sky and summit. So one simple sentence, but now within that you've already got 4 perhaps nuances broadly, and within those sometimes sub-nuances. So let's dwell on each. Religion, and we'll take a few examples. Religion has admitted an occult element in its ritual, ceremony, sacraments. You'll find, let's take the example of Christianity. You have, particularly in the Catholic tradition, this aspect of ritual which is quite strong. And the rituals may be done in front of the lay people by the priest, or sometimes there are rituals which are reserved for the priests when they're separate from the lay people. For whatever reason, they have an occult dimension which is sometimes powerful enough that they may not want it exposed, or may be too strong for others, or it can be misused perhaps. And interestingly, the priest himself has to be prepared for the occult aspect of the ritual. Otherwise, the ritual may be less effective, it may be mixed in its results, or he may be unable to contain the power of the ritual. Now, whatever I've said is not specific to Christianity, it's common among all. You will see in the Hindu rituals similarly, in the Buddhist rituals similarly, in the Mahayana, particularly the Tibetan tradition, it's much more strong than in the Theravada. And the two similarly are between the Catholic Christianity versus Protestant Christianity, the loss of rituals in the Protestant tradition largely, but with it the rejection also of the occult power that comes with it. There's an interesting observation that the mother makes in the agenda. She says in Protestant Christianity, they sought out the deeper true experience, rejecting the occult element that came with the ritual. And so they lost the occult power, but going for a more pure, direct spiritual experience. But in the Catholic tradition, they held the occult power to the detriment of the deeper spiritual experience. And then she comments, it would be so good if these two aspects could have come together. In India, when you go to the temples, the two are held together quite easily, for the reason that the temple priest is not part of this hierarchical structure as the Christian church creates. And each is independent. Each is allowed to grow in his spiritual journey. He is given a preparation, he is given a base, but then he is set free to grow in his own way. And so what you see is certain priests have a deeper spiritual experience, others don't. Some are merely doing the ritual, but still they may get a result because of the occult component and the automatic outcome of the ritual. It's fascinating to see this sometimes. I remember once I was in Orissa, there was somebody who had the metal plates on which he would show you it is blank, and then he would close them. He would ask you to think of a question, and he'll open the plates, and the writing there would reveal what is in your thought. I happened to be there. I happened to be with a friend who knew him, so they took me along. And I had an interview. As it turned out, it was on a Wednesday. And he said, Wednesday is the day I don't do this because that's the day of my founder. So I said, okay, great. Let me just ask you a few questions. I asked him his story. How did he get hold of this? And so his story began like this. I was a priest in this temple. And then he said, like all priests, I didn't believe in the deity. That was a bit of a surprise as an admission. And then after many years of doing my rituals, one day I asked myself, I want to have darshan of the deity. It was a goddess. And so I did my certain practices. I asked him what practices. So he described certain practices of meditation, pranayam, breathing, something. And then he said, so one day she came in my dream. So I paused, wait, did you ever have darshan of her? You were seeking? He said, yes, I had, many times. Interesting, it was so casual. The two aspects, the first when he said, like all priests, I didn't believe. It was so casual. And then he started his journey. And did you have the experience? Oh yes, of course. Equally casual. And this I find interesting. There was no drama associated. One day it was dramatic, I woke up. Yes, I had. I didn't have. It's something so simple. And then she came in dream. She asked him to go to a particular place. He went into the water and the whole occult thing where he got this thing. And he didn't know how to use it. Then someone came and taught him. So that's all in summary. But this aspect of the occult side and the spiritual side are left free. In the Tibetan tradition, you'll find this huge, dramatic exaggeration of the ceremonies. They are not individual, they are grand, they are collective. And it's as if the collectivity together is going through this ritual, and the collectivity together receives, and there's a grandiose element and perhaps a collective benefit as a result. You don't see that in a large part of the Hindu ceremonies. We do have those Vedic rituals where there is a collective, maybe 2 or 3 people involved. They have occasionally, which is rarely done now, ceremonies where they may have many fireplaces and up to 108 fireplaces with priests on each, and sometimes 2 or 3 working together to make for a grand collective power invocation, manifestation. And very rarely, because it's so expensive now, 1008. And that's still done in Kerala by a few, but they have such strict demands that I'm told there are hardly 2 or 3 people alive who know how to do it. And when they say no, they don't mean by the technical knowledge which you write in a book, but to have the competence to hold the consciousness, hold or invoke the presence on that kind of scale. But you see there, the idea that the knowledge was an experiential knowledge, even in its occult and spiritual aspect. And it's as if at some point the occult and the spiritual blend. The occult ceremony is to invoke a spiritual presence, and which you can often feel when they do that invocation. There's a light. And afterwards, the ritual includes a release. You have invoked the gods, now you say enough, thank you, we're grateful for whatever, and now you're freed and release them to go away. And I asked them why. They said, well, if they stay on, it can be too much, it can be too intense, and it can destabilize human life. Interesting idea, which is not the case with the pure spiritual presence, which you can invoke, which can stay. And you may ask, release it only if you're going to go away and you don't want it to remain neglected, but there is no such compulsion. So it shows the power of the occult method to draw something, but what it draws has the sense of limitation of the occult method itself. What is interesting though is they do the ritual, the result is almost automatic, with or without your competence. When your competence is there, the result is that much greater because the conscious spiritual engagement is also there. There was a ritual here at the Ganesh temple near the ashram, which they are supposed to do, I believe, every 12 years to purify the presence of Ganesha, to re-invoke, to regenerate as if, because it weakens with time with all the mixtures people bring and so on. And for that purpose, they created a structure where they had the fireplaces, Yajna Kunda, 4 of them, 4 separate structures. So I went and met the chief priest and I wanted to understand. He said the 4 represent the 4 Vedas. It's not just that. The 4 Vedas, if you see, represent 4 aspects of the divine in expression. And so it's as if those 4 are there. And the third one, which is the most technical, they had many fireplaces of different shapes. And he says this is where the power of Ganesha is assembled. All his weapons, powers, aspects, arms, whatever the term you use, aspects of the power. And it's built up in each one, invoked separately, and then transferred from one to the next. And finally, in the last, the whole assembly of the consciousness is complete. And then I said, what do you do next? He said, it goes into the water pot, which is in the center. And it's the water container which now holds Ganesha, who has been invoked in all his aspects. I said, then what do you do? You're doing this outside on the road, the temple is there. He said, then we carry it and place it and pour it on the Ganesha idol and transfer the power. And he said, I asked, how do you take it? He said, well, we place it on our head. And then he suggested something. He said, once you do that, you don't have any control over yourself. He chooses how you will go, where you will go. Sometimes the person will walk in an unusual wander around before he enters. But he basically said that he loses all awareness of himself. So I asked him, what does it feel like when you take this? And there were 2 of them, chief priest and his main assistant. And they looked at each other and smiled, secret smile. We know what experience we have, but how do you explain it? And then the first one said, it is as if 1,000 suns open up in my heart. I don't remember if he said 100 or 1,000, but it really doesn't matter. It's 100 suns or 1,000 suns open up in my heart. And then he says, I am no more me. It is only the Ganesh presence that leads, or whichever deity has been invoked, until they transfer it to the idol. I have known of, because this varies according to regions, I have known of spaces, particularly in Kerala, where the more occult aspects of the practices are more strongly held, where they do the transfer also by identification. The human is still always the vessel. You see, the water pot, who invoked it? The human. Who carries it? The human. Who transfers it? The human. So always the human is the link point. The human then transfers into the idol through a process of identification of each body part with the deity, the idol, and the transfer is made. So there are many such variations to the practice, but essentially the idea, if you catch, you could build your own little ritual which represents for you this movement. But the fact that they do it in this mechanism, with or without any other capacity, leads you to the result, because that's the occult power of the system. And so religion has admitted an occult element in its ritual, ceremony, sacrament. So ceremonies are more complex. We see, for example, ceremonial initiations. Every child is given a ceremonial initiation at various stages. Ceremony for marriage, ceremonies with death, and so on. And all of these have an occult element. If you think about what they contain, you'll see something common, and then specifics which are different. Of course, in ceremony of birth, there is always the welcoming and the hoping or giving a form and direction to the life. In the ceremony of death, of course, it's the release, going away. But interestingly, there are certain traditions, I believe in the Islamic tradition, where they will say, don't go away, stay on. Until the day when finally you will have the, what do they call it, the day of judgment, when finally we will all go together in heaven, but don't go away. Now it's something unusual, which I heard in a strange context. It was said by somebody here in the ashram who was interested in occultism, and he was meeting all kinds of magicians. I don't have a better word for it. Low-level magicians. And he was told this by one of these magicians. He said, when we go to get powers, we reach out for these beings. And then he said, the Muslim beings, or the beings who have passed on a Muslim, are more powerful because they are more attached to the earth. Because in their tradition, they say, don't go away, stay on. Whereas in the Hindu tradition, they say, now you go away, don't come back, get on with your life, go on with your journey. And the same with the Buddhist tradition. In their book of the Dead, they will say, okay, now you make transition, go to the next, but don't come back. Your goal is liberation or going on to your journey. And so it was put in a very odd context. In the black magician's practice, they found access to a spirit which has been told, don't go away, stay on, to be more powerful because he is more tied to earth. Of course, you may do that to a human soul. The soul will not stay, the soul goes. But something of the vital body stays on. And the lower beings can catch that, feed on it, or use it as a vehicle to interfere or engage with human affairs. That's what they were tapping upon. But this is again to say, in any ceremony, there is this occult element. If you go into the details of the ceremony, you can see the same principles common, the forms so different. And finally, he uses this word, ritual, ceremony, and sacraments. And these are in traditions where you give a sacred form to certain transitional things. For example, the ceremony for marriage, you can treat as a sacrament. The marriage vows are a sacrament. But objects which is given, for example, prasad. When you come, if you go to an Indian temple, you will find the priest having done the puja with the flame, now comes out with the flame, and everybody will put their hands on above the flame and as if take the energy or the vibration and take it on themselves. It's as if you're catching something of that and taking. If you go through that exercise, you'll actually feel a kind of a warmth and a vibration, very distinct. And often it's distinct according to the deities involved. Somehow what is invoked there, a part of it is brought out and made available. It could take a more physical form. A flower is given to you, or a fruit is given, or an object which is placed, cloth draped on the deity, now given. In the Christian tradition, the blood of Christ and the flesh of Christ. But the material you're eating has nothing to do with the blood or flesh. How do you associate it? That's what the ceremony did. It connected it to what those things represented and the energy comes through. And so, especially when it comes to sacraments, most religions tend to be very careful not to waste what it contains. And they treat it as actually containing a special power which can be lost, misused, and so on. There are sacraments also which relate to objects. So, objects used by the founder of the religion, of course, is special because it carries his imprint or his energy. But even objects which have been dedicated to the deity then have the power or have a role in that. There is in the Tibetan tradition a tool which is used, it's called the Vajra. And literally, Vajra means in the Sanskrit weapon, shield, a weapon generally. And it's a weapon of action. It's a power of action. If you take that object, you can actually steal the power of action if it has an occult component. So you will have these stories that such and such a thing was stolen from the temple, and since then we don't have this phenomenon occurring anymore. Or the person who stole now carries the power and the other person has lost it, and so on. All of which would apply to occult influences but have no relevance to something which is purely spiritual. So, this is the first aspect, religion admitting an occult element. And his phrasing is so suggestive. He says, religion has admitted an occult element. Next phrase, it has leaned upon spiritual thinking. What's the difference? Admitted and leaned upon. So, the master of language, so you have to dwell on the meaning. Admitted an occult element, meaning you have allowed it in, but it was always kept out before. You have allowed it in, but grudgingly. You are not comfortable with its admission. You would rather it was not there. Whereas lean upon, you need it for support. If it was not there, you might collapse. So, it has leaned upon spiritual thinking, deriving from it sometimes a creed or theology. Sometimes it's supporting spiritual philosophy. So if it didn't have the spiritual thinking, religion would very quickly break down. This is a problem you will see everywhere, and especially with young people who ask, why this? What's the point of it? What is silly? What is so meaningful here? It's so silly, it doesn't make sense to me, explain. And if you simply say that's how it is, you will lose your following in a single generation, at least today. Maybe it would have been there 500 years ago, people said okay, but now they won't. You have to have some element of the spiritual thinking because it leads you to this experience, because it has a special value, because when you take the food, when you take the prasad, you will feel the spiritual presence or power. It will bring clarity of mind, it will awaken your aspiration. Whatever the explanation, whether true or not, it has to have a spiritual turn and an understanding in thought, without which the whole thing becomes a hollow set of rituals and very quickly breaks down. In fact, we are seeing this happen everywhere in all religions, the ritual elements being dropped until at some point you feel, oh, now we are losing the spiritual benefit. And then as if you try to bring it back just to get only the spiritual benefit, dropping the rest which seems to have no other value. So, as it often happens today in marriage ceremonies in India, the actual total Vedic ceremonial form of the wedding ceremony can go for multiple hours, 2, 3, 4, depending on variations of local traditions. And people get tired. The couple gets tired, but people as audience get fed up. And everybody says minimum version. So the priests come to you and say, do you want the long version or short version? Okay, let's go with the minimum. So the priest makes his own selection of what he considers important. Even there you can say, why do I have to sit through this mumbo jumbo? I don't understand a word because it's all in Sanskrit. And this is all a recent phenomenon. It's all in the last 100 years. If you go back more than 100 years, everybody pretty much understood what the Sanskrit language carried. So you knew what was being done, you were participating in it. Today the priest goes, mama, 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 now you sit quietly, now you place your hand, mama, mama, now you do this. And now again you repeat, again you repeat, again you repeat. Why? Why repeat 3 times? Doesn't make sense. So simplify to just doing it once. No meaning. But if you had been told the first time you're doing it to invoke the presence in your mind, the second time in your life energies, the third time in your body. Wow, this is precious. I don't want to fold it into a single movement. Or you may say, well, I don't need this. I'm going to invoke in all three in a single movement, and you don't need perhaps 3 separate steps. But then you're doing it on all 3 levels in a single step. But if you don't have that understanding, so much of it becomes pointless and can just be thrown aside, even though you may be losing something valuable in the process. And so we are going through that passage. Sri Aurobindo writes about this in the very beginning of the synthesis of yoga, where the whole world is going through this passage. He uses the term the cauldron. It's a Greek term, I forget the name. The cauldron in which all the pieces of human body are thrown in, it goes through bubbling, and out comes a new form of elements which are relevant. And if the old form was relevant, it comes out revivified. If it's not, it dissolves, or the part of it which is relevant takes on a new shape and comes out with a new form. And that's the transition today happening everywhere in the world, in all traditions. You will see in the Native American traditions, very interestingly, they also have their own rituals and sacraments. The feather which is placed in the cap is a sacrament. And there's a way by which you become worthy of carrying the feather or other tools. The tobacco you carry is a sacrament. It has a particular use in the ritual. If you don't have your tobacco pouch, suddenly you find you're powerless. For my ritual, I need my tobacco pouch, and my pouch, not someone else's tobacco, because I've worked on it and it has something of the power I have built up. All of these things you'll find common everywhere. But having done that, the younger generations have not received this knowledge. In fact, it's a shocking thing. In the United States, under US law, the Native Americans, first of all, were denied their rights to their own land. They were denied the right to practice their own religion and speak their own language. And by law, they could not practice their religion until 1978, when the law was changed. And that's a very long time. It's only recently that it has been removed. Now, going back several generations, where you're not allowed to practice your tradition, what will survive of it? And whatever little survives is secretly passed on and large parts lost. But in the process, if you had to give to it a positive side, you will say a filter was imposed in which that which is most essential will have survived. And other elements which were valuable but not essential may have been lost. But they could be recovered if the most essential is not lost. But if the most essential is lost, then the whole culture is lost, because that's what holds it together. And the same thing is happening, though less restricted, in India, where the influence of what is called modernism, but the entire educational system taught to the teaching given to young children, going back now 150 years nearly, was formulated by the British to uproot the civilization, to make it experience shame over its own past and disgust or disdain for its own inheritance, was designed and implemented. And through 150 years, if you persist, you experience a collision. In the school with English language, you have this almost hatred for your own culture and values. You come home and your parents are carrying it, and it creates a gap in the family and in the ability to transmit those values. And as a result, so much has been lost, including very specific kinds of knowledge which were held by families traditionally. And by holding in family, you protected it. So even if you go back barely 200 years ago, you had at least a few hundred Vedic lineages carrying the Vedic traditions or aspects of the Vedic tradition. Today it's down to 3 or 4 only that survive. All others have been lost just in the last 200 years. And of course, other kinds of knowledge and traditions and values particularly. So one of the values which we had as children, because it was transmitted from parents, and you can only receive this when you're a very young child. You wake up from sleep and you pray to Mother Earth. The prayer goes like this. I'm paraphrasing, summarizing. You, Goddess, beloved of the Lord, who are clothed in the oceans, who nourishes all life through her mountains, please forgive that I place my feet on you. Please forgive that I place my feet on you. Suddenly your picture of the divine, of the earth is divine being, Goddess, beloved of the Lord. And on her you're going to place your feet. But the picture given to you visually, who's clothed by the oceans. Where have you seen this picture? Now every child who has not been in space has actually seen the earth from space, clothed by the oceans. You see pictures of the earth from outer space, from the moon. You see this blue, 3/4 of the surface is blue, clothed by the oceans. But this, in your mind's eye, you have this picture of the totality of the earth and as a goddess, and you're placing your feet. You start your day with this relationship with Mother Earth. And you can imagine what will happen the rest of the day. In all your dealings with anything to do with the earth, and pretty much everything you do has to do with the earth. If you've grown up in the village, well, you're walking on the soil barefoot. Okay, you have slippers, but nominally you're dealing with life, plants, growth, everything to do with earth. What's happening today, you wake up in a flat, in a multi-storied apartment, and when you wake up, you have the TV blaring. You're eating food which is concocted, not cooked by your parents, manufactured from somewhere with paper and sawdust plugged in to give you a sense of texture and taste with chemicals. You step out, you're walking on tiles which are glazed. You never touch earth. You wear shoes which are rubber. Again, you never have electrical contact with the soil. You're sitting or walking always on surfaces which are insulated. You enter an air-conditioned classroom. You never touch a tree. You never meet an animal or a cow. If you ask a child today in India's cities, where does milk come from? If he has studied in school, he will say cow. Have you seen a cow? No. If he has not studied in school, he'll say from the milk carton. That's what milk means to you. It's this liquid that comes in a carton. And you've never seen a cow. You go to Beijing, you ask children, have you seen stars? Never in their life they've seen stars. Because the air is so poisoned, you never see the sky, night sky. And they've never been out of the city. So the disconnection from the earth is so great. And with it all the other, not only physical illnesses, but mental illnesses. But drifted a little bit, but the idea behind it is that there were traditions which held deep truths which formed the future generations. You lose the essential element, you will lose the whole culture. Everything will be gone. You will die out. But if you hold the essential element and it survives, it will rebuild itself. And even if the non-essential important elements were lost, they will be rediscovered somehow. And why? I often look at it this way. The people who held it in the past are also taking birth again, isn't it? It's within you somehow, and if it had a spiritual value, it will come out in some form. I often meet, because this happened when I was particularly meeting with the Native Americans and their people. Sometimes it was a white American who was more Native American than someone who's born in the native genetics. And it was clear that they were of that side, now having taken this side to help make this bridge and correct for what was lost, because they had certain advantages here than there, and vice versa. And it was interesting to see also in Peru and Mexico, because there's been such a mix of blood from the colonization phase. But there was something unusual to see. One had the sense that certain people were reborn who came with deep knowledge, and now they had to as if draw it out from what they were carrying internally. And what is relevant will be recovered. What is not relevant has to go anyway. So this is an aspect which is critical to a religion's survival, it has leaned upon spiritual thinking. And what are the two elements here? Spirit and thought. Mind has to understand. This is a critical element for the sustenance for the future. It's not enough that I practice. If I don't understand, it will not survive, it will not transmit. So spiritual thinking. And from this spiritual thinking, two things can be derived. Deriving from it sometimes a creed or theology. Sometimes it's supporting spiritual philosophy. Now what you see in the former ordinarily is the Occidental method. You have to ask, why does he say ordinarily? The latter, deriving spiritual philosophy, the Oriental, and he doesn't use the word ordinarily. So we'll see a few examples of this. So from spiritual thinking, you can create a whole creed or a theology and a belief system. Let's take the example of Christianity. There is a tradition which predates Christianity. And a large part of Christianity draws from not one but several of these, but particularly one from which it drew its original inspiration. And what it received from there, it had to give to it certain forms which were relevant to that age. In passing through, many of its texts which it took as sacred, inherited from the past, went through at least two levels of translation. So there was a Sumerian text, which was like an origin text of how we came on earth, which then was translated into Hebrew, which got translated into Greek or Aramaic, and then became Latin or whatever the language was used for further dissemination, which today becomes English. And from English version of the Bible, which is now the authentic, you again translate into other languages. Now, each of these levels of translations, you lose so much. Considering especially the fact that the farther back you go in time, the more the languages were root-centric. That is, the meaning was root-based and not thought-based. And you see this especially in Sanskrit, or in ancient Greek, or ancient Latin, or even to some extent in the language in which Islam, Saudi Arabia, in Arabic, of modern Arabic, you'll also find root elements strongly. Very strong, certainly, in the Hebrew tradition, where the roots are still held intact, as in Sanskrit. Almost everywhere else they're gone. Sanskrit and Hebrew are the two which still play with that knowledge. But going back, and if you go into Egyptian, again it's distinctly root-centric. The hieroglyphs are literally roots. Each root carries multiple aspects of meaning. So you combine two roots and you get not one single thought, but a multifaceted thought. When you translate it into a language which cannot contain that, you have to reduce it to a facet and you lose everything. And you go through two translations, even the meaning changes and the nuances change. So the word sin, for example, in Christianity, original sin, if you go back to its Hebrew root, the word has the sense of ignorance and not of the moralistic sin which the church teaches today. And at that point, at the root level, it corresponds perfectly with the yoga tradition. Sri Aurobindo puts it this way: the only sin is ignorance. But the phrasing original sin is the original ignorance, the ignorance in which the world originates. The fragmentation of consciousness that makes for the world to be a divided and dualistic experience. And that's the fall from heaven, from the Garden of Eden. And so that's the original sin, the fall of the soul into domain of duality. And you see, the whole meaning is so different from what the church teaches, but also perfectly aligned to the yoga and the Upanishadic phrasing, even vocabulary. But now, because you've gone through a couple of translations and you've given to it a form of thought which is common to that day, which was moralistic, you can see what a mess it can make. I'm pointing to this because in the process of creating a creed and a belief system and a theology, which now everybody has to believe and follow, you have rigidified even something which was half true or even utterly false. The whole story of the origin and the Genesis, as it is called, the whole origin of Genesis is the story of soul and nature, which is Adam and Eve, and their descent into the domain of duality. That's the fall. And how do you make out that this is Adam and Eve are soul and nature? Because in the Bible it is said God creates Eve out of Adam's rib. Again, it's ridiculous. You break a rib and a whole person comes out. Why a rib? Why not heart? Which should be much more meaningful. A part of your heart becomes your beloved. But it doesn't make sense. It's illogical. You go back to the root. Again, going to Hebrew. You don't have to go all the way back. In Hebrew, the word for rib is the same word for will. The soul's will forms soul's nature. Very simple, very obvious. And nature tempts the soul now to experience her multifaceted world experience. And the soul is fascinated, enters that experience, loses its unity, loses its oneness in the divine, and enters experience of duality and multiplicity of nature. Eve has tempted Adam, but Eve was formed of his will, rib. And this very simple, profound story, as it turns into a theology and a creed and a common groupthink, you see how much damage it has done, how much suffering it has caused over centuries, because people were told again and again, you should be guilty because you are born of sin. And the sin was caused by someone who you had no power to change. You are suffering from their sin, but you are born of sin. I found this something which was for me surprising, and it came up again and again in my travels in Europe. The sense of guilt, which was rooted in the culture at a level so deep that people were not even conscious. And it came from that theology, from the church teaching. Even though they were not formally in the church teaching, it had seeped into the culture and somehow was there. And to say that you're a free soul and there is no need for guilt, you're here to experience the growth of life, they would say, wow, what a beautiful idea, and then slip back into the guilt. Until they became conscious that there was this guilt, because it was almost like a backdrop of the forming in the culture itself. And once they became conscious, they could remove it. But it was sticky even at that point. So deriving from the spiritual thinking, a creed or theology. And the problem with creed and theology is you have to have everybody believe this and follow this. If you see the definition of the word religion, as a word, it doesn't exist in India. You have no equivalent translation. It comes from the religare, relink, reconnect. And the way it is interpreted today, religion is what links all of us together. That's how they tell you. No, that's not how it was. It is what links you back to the source, to the divine. That linking has been replaced by this group linking, social linking, which becomes the dominant objective of the creed and theology. And you see how everything slips out of alignment. In India, this kind of groupthink is alien. Because the original conception is of dharma, where each soul has its own dharma to follow his own line of development. And if there are truths, they tend therefore to remain at the level of thought and philosophy, into which or to which you give a form unique to your own life, values, priorities, practice. So what you see, supporting spiritual philosophy. From spiritual thinking, it has taken on a spiritual philosophy form, and the philosophies may take these forms as if, oh, you're born to develop, to grow, to realize God, or to get free from ignorance, to rise out of limitation, whatever form it is, to attain moksha. or to fulfill your duty or dharma, whatever variation one may give to it, and around it the whole knowledge of relationships, karma, interconnections, a whole philosophy forms from certain insights. And you see the difference now. It has leaned upon spiritual thinking, deriving from it sometimes a creed or theology, sometimes it's supporting spiritual philosophy. And now the religion leans on this spiritual philosophy to give it meaning, form, direction. And whenever the rituals or the forms of the religion hit conflict, you fall back on this supporting spiritual philosophy to justify or to navigate the conflict. When, for example, this is an incident narrated where Ramana Maharshi's mother passed away, he asked for her to be buried, I think. And they said, no, that's not acceptable according to religion. And then it was Ramana Maharshi's eminent disciple, Ganapati Muni, who quoted scripture, philosophy, to say that one who is a liberated being is not bound by any of these laws. And she had been liberated by Maharshi before she passed away. He had dissolved all her karmas. And they said, okay, so it's acceptable. You see how you have a crisis, you don't know how to manage, you go back to that something, lean on it, bring to meaning, bring order. But you see, the element which comes has a thought component, which brings clarity, reason. And the critical point to make is this spiritual thought and its philosophy or creed has to have reason supporting experience. It's the only way reason can align. Unfortunately, creed or theology, reason is what has been suppressed. And so eventually it has to break down, or it creates great darkness and confusion. So the former, creed or theology, ordinarily is the Occidental method. Why ordinarily? Because that's what you see in the large mass. But it's not so all the time. It's not so in the smaller parts of the Occident. And there you have traditions which have tried to retain something of the spiritual philosophy. And you find this in movements such as the Freemasons, in the Rosicrucian orders, in the Templar orders, and many such secret societies. And inevitably they had to be secret because precisely they had to struggle against the creed and theology and the power, political power of the church, and sometimes quite a destructive and vicious power. And so they survived like little pockets, connecting secretly, sharing with each other, having signs to recognize each other, and even forms of conversation to validate whether it was not someone pretending because the signs have been now leaked out, and so on. That culture remains to this day in the Occident. Whereas in the East, you don't find that. What happened in the East is, and look at the text, the latter, in the Oriental, because it was much more open, because it was allowing each one to follow their own way, no secrecy was required, no groups needed to be formed or hide from other groups. So everything was much more in the open. The only thing which was hidden were the more powerful aspects, the occult aspects, even in the rituals or traditions, which might be misused. But the fact that they existed was not hidden, only the particular knowledge of it was held back. And so you do not find secret societies in the East. And you do not find the need for this to be hidden. And a very rich and wide opening of traditions, rising, falling, and all kinds of little communities forming, fading out. Now even their names are gone, but they left their imprint. At that moment, they fulfilled what was required. But also, he says, no, but spiritual experience, this is the third component, is the final aim and achievement of religion, its sky and summit. Again, we can pause here and dismiss it as simply poetic articulation, sky and summit. You see, sky, mountaintop. Why? And Sri Aurobindo is not wasting words. So let's look at what that means. Final aim of all religion is the spiritual experience that we understand, and it is the achievement also. When do you, in your spiritual journey, do you say you have now reached the goal of the religion? When you have the spiritual experience and you've achieved it and established yourself in it. But there are two approaches to that goal. And that's what he is describing as sky and summit. In the first approach, there is the sense of entering in relation with the divine in a manner that you lose individuality. You open out into the universal or into the transcendence. There is no more the person. That's this line of spiritual development. That's what you see in Buddhism, for example, and in even certain forms of mystical Christianity. In other approaches, religion, you have reached the summit. The height of what the religion describes is the state of consciousness in closeness to God. So the saint now lives in a state where he sees everywhere God, and he enters into states of ecstasy. He repeats God's name and enters into this state of immersion. And that's like the peak. There's very clearly a point, a poise, a goal. And so when Sri Aurobindo describes the ultimate result of religion, it's sky and summit. But also, religion has sometimes banned occultism or reduced its own occult element to a minimum. You see this in Europe, in Christianity going against what they called witches. Anybody who had any deeper occult knowledge, even of healing, was called a witch. And often what would happen in Europe was the women were the carriers of this knowledge. Men also, but women more easily because they were not held so much in the structure of society. They were made to become subservient to the male structure. The men were formed, shaped. Education of whatever kind was meant to shape. And the women were left unformed or prevented from being too formed or individualized because they had to serve. They had to look after house, etc. The result was they were actually left free and more closely open to the deeper inner ranges. You will see in all these secret societies, almost all of them were men. Women were not admitted in it. So there was one lady who I met who was speaking about the Freemasons, and she said, in Europe we did not, the women didn't need to enter it because it was only the men who needed to be made more cultured. Women already had it. Well, in a way. But the point was they were often the carriers also of the culture. It is they who transmitted to the children the values. And the most important values in the nourishment of the life. And so they carried also the knowledge. A daughter learns from her mother all the healing therapies and means. And if she now is able to successfully heal people of certain illnesses, the church would pick them up and say, you must be a witch. And the evidence for that was very simple. If you were tortured until you accepted that you were a witch, in which case you were killed. And if you didn't accept, you were tortured on until you died. That was all. So you didn't have much choice. It was so misused. And the result was, I don't know how, I recall reading some 30 million or so people who were burnt at the stake or tortured to death. And the whole knowledge of access to the inner or higher realms that they carried, even an occult knowledge, was wiped out and held only by the church within its control. So it was actually an attempt to prevent knowledge from spreading out or the access of the inner and spiritual realms. So it was a very, very dark period. But in the justification, it was, that is bad. And the element of justification he touches in a different form here. It has pushed away philosophic mind as a dry, intellectual alien, leaned with all its weight on creed and dogma. No, okay. So I'm jumping a few lines. We'll see later. Occultism has put forward spiritual goal, etc. But it has degenerated. He says it has turned to thaumaturgy or mere magic, or even deviated into diabolism. That was used as the excuse for anything not taught by the church to be destroyed. The same thing you will see in Islam. Wherever Islam spread in its particularly later, more extreme forms, they would come to the Library of Alexandria, which was repository for Egypt and that whole part of Europe, but also in India, all the biggest libraries and universities. They said, if what is written exists in the Quran, then it is superfluous. You don't need it, so you can destroy it. If it is not existing in the Quran, then it is false, and so you must destroy it. That was the very simplistic and perverse logic used to destroy all knowledge which the invaders did not control. And it was all of these were movements to somehow control and suppress the populace. But in the process, you see the truth which was misused. The fact that occultism can deviate from the deeper or truer goal of spirit or even of the religion. So, religion has sometimes banned occultism or reduced its own occult element to a minimum. You see this in the turning away from ritual in Protestant Christianity. And yet, the Protestants have their own sacraments, their own priorities, their own forms, which become for them, which have a certain occult force, but minimized to that extent. And then he says, it has pushed away the philosophic mind as a dry, intellectual alien, leaned with all its weight on creed and dogma. And you see this, we don't need to take too many examples here. Creed, dogma, pietistic emotion and fervor and moral conduct. So I think every religion has passed through passages where it was only moralistic, heart-based, no thinking, no reason, no mind. It has reduced to a minimum or dispensed with spiritual realization and experience. And of course, at that point, it loses all purpose, becomes just a machinery. And you will see, particularly the most dogmatic religions are most open to this. In Islam, you see this taken an interesting form. As it became more and more dogmatic, especially with the Wahhabi school, on the other side, the spiritual and experiential component tries to survive, taking on the forms of Islam in what is called Sufism. And the word Sufi is pure. So you are the pure element of Islam. So it distinguished itself from the crude and coarse by maintaining purity, but the focus there was a direct experience, direct relation to God, not going through these other forms. But inevitably, you see the very attempt of religion to narrow itself causes a fragmentation, because a piece of the followers says, but we need this, and it breaks. Every attempt in a movement to narrow causes fissures and splits in the movement. And every attempt to widen tends to embrace and learn from other movements, other traditions, to enrich each other. So this is in sum what he has, in summary, the way religion has related to these other three lines of development. He will make a similar treatment, which we will take up next Sunday, of occultism, and then spiritual philosophy, and then even of the inner experience directly. And looking at it, we get the big picture that all four were impulses led by nature. Even the development of religion is an impulse led by nature. And she is working through that impulse multiple objectives, including social development, including political development, including culture and refinement, and specific aspects of culture. And that's why these things are justified in the past. What's the relevance now, and particularly now in this phase as we turn to the practice of the integral yoga for a spiritual emergence of spiritual being from the mental being? That's when we will see how all these threads which he has described will be drawn together into certain essential movements and given an essential form for the practice. This is to give the big picture of this discussion. We can pause here for today. To fully appreciate these fine nuances of Sri Aurobindo's statement, one needs to have a very rich historical background. Sri Aurobindo himself had such a deep and rich background, not only of histories, not only of languages, of cultures, and even in the consciousness in which he wrote the vision of all these periods of history. In the record of yoga, where we get a glimpse of some of these, he describes how he sees repeatedly a series of visions of the blending of two cultures, civilizational and barbaric, one more refined, one more coarse and crude but strong, and the two meeting. And repeatedly there is this image of the man who seizes the woman from the other side, from the refined side, and leading to a transition. And then at a later age, the same thing repeated, now in a different consciousness. And later, the same thing repeated in a still higher consciousness. And you see the pattern each time taking one step up. And this he's just describing very casually because he's noted in his diary. And the conclusion is how, through layers and levels, the slow evolution of humanity takes place. And he had a vision in which he could see all this. And so when he describes this, he is catching these broad movements and summarizing them in a few phrases. And if you fully want to appreciate, you must look back at what has happened. And all of it now makes so much sense. Otherwise, in history books, you'll say, this happened, that happened, oh, unfortunate, oh, how sad. Why couldn't it have been different? Now you see why it couldn't have been different, because nature was pushing all four directions. And there was always this struggle to unify, to specialize, unify, specialize. What a slow evolution we have all been through in our soul's journey to bring us to this point of awakening. And that's why it's so important to remind ourselves, here in this life we have an opportunity never had before, where all that effort, all that struggle has a chance to fulfill itself in the breakthrough of the spiritual awakening, in the spiritual being emerging and evolving. And it is worth it to dedicate ourselves entirely to this purpose. And so I reread the line from last time where he puts it this way: it is the one thing needful that has to be done by each on whatever line is possible to him, by each according to the spiritual capacity developed in his nature. And that is the foundation of a pure spiritual consciousness that is the first object in the evolution of the spiritual man. This foundation we have to develop.